So unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard at least a little bit about what's going on in Cuba over the last week or so. And I have a lot to say about this because, yes, there are legitimate grievances that the Cuban people have. Um, and I'm not going to discredit that. And I'll get more into that later. But it is stunning to me how casually prominent figures, political figures here in the United States, will just call for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. For several reasons. Of course, if you follow this channel, the work I do here, and other people in new media do covering the endless wars and the imperialism, the cost of these wars is the human toll is almost impossible to put into words. And I'll get later, a little bit later in the video, I'll get into some of the most epic regime change failures from the United States over the last few decades. But overall, once we start a war, once we start regime change, covert or overt, it unleashes chaos into a country even worse than might already exist. And what I need people to understand is once you open up, it's like Pandora's box. And once you open that up, once you start a war, terrible things are going to happen. And the situation on the ground for people in the country are objectively going to get worse. So it really bothers me, like I said, how casually politicians and powerful people in the United States will call for such an extreme reaction to protests in Cuba. But also, like, aside from the typical cost of these regime change wars, with Cuba in particular, there should be extra caution because the closest we've ever come to completely exterminating life on this planet and having a nuclear exchange between countries was the Cuba Missile Crisis. So for people to just casually, like I said, just flippantly, like, oh yeah, let's do some airstrikes in Cuba. Let's go bomb Cuba. Let's start a war in Cuba. Let's try to overthrow their government. The people just flippantly throw that out there, completely just glossing over the context of what are us trying to do this very same exact thing in Cuba decades ago almost led to. And so, like I said, there are legitimate grievances that people in Cuba may have. There are real problems. There are food shortages in the country. There are medicine shortages in the country, shortages of medical supplies and things like that. The living conditions continue to get worse, and the pandemic has exacerbated it. The decline in tourism that's already been, and the tourism industry in Cuba has already been, before COVID, was heavily impacted by the U.S. sanctions and blockade, and I'll get to that. So yes, the situation for the living condition for people in Cuba is not great. And it definitely needs to be improved, and it is a humanitarian crisis. And in any country, that is more than enough for people to get in the streets and be angry and to be protesting and agitating and demanding change. So I don't want to just flippantly dismiss all of the protesters as just CIA plans and just part of a whole CIA regime change operation. But at the same time, it's worth acknowledging that this is part of the playbook, the regime change playbook that the U.S. has instituted for decades around the world. We and the CIA specifically was created for exact situations exactly like this, where the US will either manufacture chaos or exploit and amplify the chaos in the country in the streets to create an opening to overthrow the government, whether it's through assassination or some type of military coup or rigging an election. They just use this chaos as an opening. The U.S. has done it, like I said, dozens of times around the world. The CIA has used this exact playbook dozens of times around the world, and just specifically here on the issue of Cuba, our own declassified documents, government documents from the CIA, the State Department, whatever, that are from back in the 60s, they've been declassified, and they show that the CIA has dozens of times over, to our knowledge, tried to overthrow the government in all the different ways that I listed earlier. And they failed epically every single time. But it goes to the intent. And that this is, like I said, this is their playbook. And anytime they can find any sort of discontent with the government or the status quo in Cuba, they're going to try to manipulate that to provoke regime change and military confrontation in Cuba. And that is incredibly important context that people need to understand. Which brings me to some of the politicians and prominent political figures here in the United States who are using this to agitate for overthrowing the Cuban government. And now, I'm specifically speaking to the politicians who I know they know better. I know they know the nuance of what's happening in Cuba, and they are purposely manipulating the situation and leaving out the U.S. role in the chaos in Cuba. So you have all these politicians, like I said, leaping at the opportunity to try to demonize the Cuban government and make a case for regime change. And I have no other way to describe it other than rank imperialist opportunism. That's what this is. It is incredibly disingenuous for these politicians, both Democrats and Republicans here in the United States, to talk about, you have people like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, Senator of Florida, talking about the U.S. needs to get involved and we need to stand with the people in Cuba and all these things. You have even one of the mayors in Miami straight up saying we should be doing airstrikes in Cuba. And all because the humanitarian crisis and people living conditions are so bad or whatever. And this is what I'm saying. This is where you would call me a cynical Susie. Because there's no way, like I said, these people are politicians. They know all the nuance of what's going on here. And they know about the U.S. blockade and the U.S. sanctions that are literally economic warfare and designed to cripple the country's economy. So they know that we've had these sanctions in place and this blockade in place for over 60 years, and the intended effect of them was to destabilize the economy in Cuba. So now that it manifests and it's the conditions are terrible, the economic conditions in Cuba are terrible. Now they're going to turn around and pretend like they're just these neutral observers and, oh, would you look at that? There's a problem there. We have to go fix it. And completely leaving out our role in this situation. And also, most importantly, leaving out how easy it would be for the U.S. to greatly improve the conditions in Cuba without any attempt at regime change or overthrowing the Syrian government. All it would take is Biden picking up a pen and signing executive order saying that the U.S. will no longer enforce these sanctions or blockade. That's all it would take, and the Cuban economy would be opened up to the rest of the world, because right now it is cut off from the rest of the world because of the sanctions and because of the blockade. And that's why there are food shortages. That's why there's shortages of medicine in Cuba. And it's not some big secret, because every single country around the world where we impose similar sanctions and where we impose blockades like this, it follows a predictable path, and the country, like I said, plunges into economic calamity. And it is impossible for a country to sustain a full-on economic assault, full-on economic warfare by the most powerful government, most powerful countries on the planet, and expect it to not have real consequences on the everyday lives of people in the country. And so that gets to the most important question here that everybody should ask who's concerned about this issue and who's talking about this issue. Do you want to help the people in Cuba? Do you want to help Cubans? And do you want to improve or the humanitarian crisis and improve their living conditions? Or do you want to overthrow the government? And those are two very different things. Because if you want to help Cubans and improve their living conditions and make sure that there aren't food shortages and make sure that there's medicines, because they don't even have basic medicine in like Tylenol and Advil, painkillers and penicillin, and they don't even have basic medicines because of the embargo. So, do you care, like I said, do you care about helping the Cubans, or do you want to overthrow the government? Because if you want to answer the first question, you want to help the Cubans, there's a very simple and easy way to do it. All Joe Biden would have to do is sign an executive order to lift the blockade and to lift the sanctions. Because, and let me show you, there's so many different ways that this blockade has devastated the economy in Cuba and has brought it to the place where it is right now. But let me just give you one example. So part of the blockade of Cuba is this rule that says any a company, shipping company that either picks up a shipment or exports a shipment from Cuba, that ship is no longer allowed to dock at any port in the United States for 180 days. That is 6 months. So that makes it so almost no shipping companies on the planet would ever want to deliver anything to Cuba, because that means that ship is no longer allowed to go to one of the most powerful, most biggest markets in the world. So they would be losing out on millions of dollars if they ship to Cuba. So that means most shipping companies are just going to say it's not worth the trouble, and I'm just not going to deliver shipments to Cuba. And so that's just one way that the sanctions and there's a whole broad a category of laws that are being enforced to make it hard for different countries to do trade with Cuba, and like I said, it has devastated the economy. So if you want to improve that situation, then people should be pressuring Joe Biden to lift the sanctions. And just a couple weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, once again at the UN, there was a vote where every country in the world voted to condemn the blockade and condemn the sanctions and calling on the US to end the sanctions. Every country in the world said that this blockade and these sanctions are devastating the Cuban economy. Literally every country that votes in the UN voted that way. The only exceptions were the US and Israel. Those are the only people who said, let's keep the blockade going. And this isn't the first time this has happened. This has been going on for 60 years. So against everybody in the world, we continue these sanctions and this blockade. So if you want to help the Cuban people, tell Joe Biden, pressure Joe Biden, because this is the way I view this whole situation. I have no control over the Cuban government. I'm not a Cuban citizen. They aren't responsive to me, but you know who's supposed to be responsive to me? My government. And if Joe Biden has the ability to improve the Cuban people's lives with just signing a piece of paper, I don't know why that isn't everybody's top priority. But here, right now, with what's going on with the whole SOS Cuba thing, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there are people, and there are many different reasons people have for wanting to overthrow the Cuban government. You have the neocons in the warmongers, the imperialists here in the United States who who've been trying to do this for decades for their own economic and strategic reasons. They want to control the island of Cuba. You also have the exiles, the people who were part of the U.S. dictatorship in Cuba before the revolution. Because everybody leaves that part out. Before the revolution and before the Castro government, there was a dictatorship backed by the U.S. and that was doing a genocide of the Cuban people and imposed slavery, and it was terrible. And once the revolution happened, the people, the ruling elites in Cuba who were part of the dictatorship, the ruling class, they were exiled and they were forced out of Cuba, and a lot of them came to Florida, a lot of them came to the United States, and ever since then, they've been helping the U.S. They've been trying to overthrow participating in U.S. plots to overthrow the government in Cuba for decades. So, like I said, they also are trying to take advantage of the situation. And it's clear because they're not saying, oh, lift the sanctions, lift the blockade. It's, oh, the U.S. needs to come in and help the Cuban people. And it gets me to where I really need people to take a step back. Because there is this really, I don't know how to explain it, like this kind of childish worldview of how we use our military here in the United States that's been fed to us since we were kids, that, you know, we use our military to spread freedom and democracy, defend freedom and democracy around the world, and protect our freedoms here and protect everybody else's freedoms around the world. That is so far from the truth. And what people need to understand is, and this isn't like my just, you know, crazy radical interpretation. If you look at the numbers, you look at the data, objectively, every single time we do these wars and we intervene and we try to overthrow a government, it has nothing to do with human rights. It has nothing to do with improving the lives of people, because objectively, the lives of people in the country get worse. Every single time it happens, there are connecting threads that are a pattern that keep showing up. And it's that U.S. corporations will always try to take control of the situation and exploit the country for their resources. In Cuba, when back there during the U.S.-backed dictatorship, the Batista dictatorship, the U.S. corporations ran off with all of Cuba's sugar and basically stole all of Cuba's sugar and kept the profit for themselves. So you have, when we go to wars, and this isn't to say anything about people you know who join the military, because honestly, most people who join the military have no idea what they're signing up for and what our military actually does. So this is more of a indictment of the people in charge of the military, the politicians and the generals and the commanders. But like I was saying, they will go there. They will start these wars just so that U.S. corporations can profit off of it. In the Middle East, in Iraq and Afghanistan, longest wars in U.S. history. And the only reason why we are there, well, first we went there and we stole the oil. So like Exxon and all the other, the oil company, natural gas companies, they were there and they stole a bunch of the oil when we invaded Iraq. And then you also have the defense contractors, the people who make the weapons, the people who make all the equipment and the gear that the military uses, the people who do the shipment, bring the equipment in and do the construction, all that stuff. It becomes a whole fucking industry, money-making operation. So people are getting rich from the war. All while it's happening, there are massacres of civilians. And so inviting the U.S. government to do military actions in Cuba, you're inviting a massacre of the Cuban people. Undoubtedly, the CIA and the State Department will find the most radical extremists in the country, give them weapons and give them funding, and unleash them on the Cuban population until they overthrow the government. That's what would end up happening. That's what we did in Syria. We're doing in Syria, giving money and weapons to the jihadists, literally ISIS and Al-Qaeda aligned groups in Syria. We were giving them money and weapons so that they could overthrow the Syrian government. Like right now. This is happening right now. The same in Yemen. Giving weapons and military equipment to Al-Qaeda in Yemen so that they can take over regions of the country for the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. They did it in Chile with Pinochet, and they did it in Guatemala, they did it in Honduras. They will find the death squads. If there aren't death squads there, they will make the death squads and give them the weapons, and they will do a genocide to maintain control of the country. So it is stunning to me that people, with all the endless wars going on, with all of the dirty wars in Latin America and the Cold War, all of these things, and people still will come out and say, let's do it again in Cuba. It blows my mind. So again, the question is, do you want to help the Cuban people, or do you want to overthrow the Cuban government? Because those things are mutually exclusive. If you want to help the Cuban people, overthrowing the government isn't going to help. It's not going to do it. It's going to make their situation, objectively, it will make the situation worse. So this is stunning. The war drums, as always, beaten in the U.S., they never stop. And it is just, there is no end to it. We're already in at least 8 different wars. Already. And it's still not enough. Let's start another one. Let's do another one. Because there was some protest.